I'm here with Dave Fisher, and we're going to be talking about loving transgender people. And we're also going to talk about Dave's story. And he's very interesting guy. I've been finding out. He's written a booklet, a free booklet called A Guide to Understanding the Transgender Mystery. And you can get that if you look in the description of this video. There's a link. And so we're going to just start. Welcome, Dave. And just to let y'all know, Dave is from Topeka, Kansas, and he is the creator of the first pocket computer. But that's not what we're talking about today. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Well, why don't you start by just telling us a little bit about you and your faith?
Okay. Well, it all started when I was about 7 years old, and I was taken to see the Joan of Arc movie by my father and mother and my sister Wendy. And we went to see it, and I watched the movie. And of course, being a young guy, I like war stories and fighting stories and, the battles and so forth. But then it got to the point where she was burned at the stake. And when she was burned at the stake, all of a sudden that touched my heart. And by the time I left at 7 years old, as I walked out of the movie theater, I just had tears running down my cheeks. And my mom asked me, "What happened?" I said, that made me so sad. And yeah, I even think about it sometimes when I think about her story. And probably for the next 2 or 3 weeks, I really was just sad various times because I kept thinking about the face of Ingrid Bergman, who was the star who played Joan of Arc, and her face when she was burned at the stake. And it really touched my heart. And one of the things she said, and of course, back then it wasn't that prevalent, swear words and so forth were not quite as big, especially from young people. But one of the things she said is, it doesn't make any difference whether you're fighting for life and death. You don't need to swear. And that's why I have never sworn. To my knowledge, I think I did one time and I just felt terrible, but it was just one little word. I don't know whether it was the word hell or something like that, but it just, I don't remember, but I just really broke my heart because, Dave, that's not me. I don't want to do it. In fact, there was a little statement that I saw once. I think it was the Country Parson or something on the newspaper, the regular newspaper. And it said, "Swearing is the crutch of the conversational cripple." And I've always thought, there's other ways. I don't criticize somebody for swearing. That's just not what I do. But it is, sometimes for me, it's just not necessary. So anyway, after, I would say probably about 2 or 3 months, then I kind of forgot about Joan of Arc and went about worried about playing baseball and basketball and football and stuff like that. Then a year later, there came a broadcast. And the broadcast was on the radio. We didn't have a TV yet, though there were some TVs in California. And in the broadcast, there was a little girl by the name of Kathy Fiscus. And Kathy Fiscus lived in California, and she was playing, and there was a well that had an open cap, and she fell in. And when she fell in that well, then they started having live broadcasts. And I would go into my mom and dad's bedroom in their closet. I had a little pocket radio kind of a thing. And I would go in there and I would listen as they would work about trying to figure out how they were going to get this little 5-year-old girl, I think she was 5, out of that well. And they were concerned, and they didn't have a lot of the technology we have today. And they were almost on the hour, there would be an update. And I would go in there and I would just cry and just think about that poor little girl. And she just touched my heart. Again, I was given, I think, when I watched Joan of Arc, the gift of compassion. So, I went in, and finally they decided they were drilling a well that was right along parallel because they couldn't go down. There was no way that she was stuck. So there was no way. So they had to drill down, find out where she was, and then drill into the side carefully so they didn't get her. And finally, they got a pediatrician. And they dropped her down on dropped the pediatrician down on the other shaft and got her, and she was dead. And I just cried and cried and cried, and I just felt terrible about it. Many years later, I was telling my sister she lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and they have a little cottage that's up on the Lake Michigan. And we were going up, and I was telling her that story. And I was in the middle of writing a book called He's Here. And it's all about my experiences with God. And I told her about that. And I said, I don't really know that much about it except how it touched my heart. She immediately gets out, Googles it. And she said, "Dave, Did you know that that actually happened in California, and that was the first live television broadcast ever done in the United States? Well, I didn't see it on TV and so forth, but that again touched my heart and the compassion. So from that standpoint, then, everything just kind of, I was just a normal boy and growing up and so forth like that. My mom and dad, my mom didn't work. My dad was the lawyer, a lawyer of one of the largest, senior partner of one of the largest law firms in Topeka. And we went to church. We went to the First United Methodist Church, and my sister and I went to Sunday school. They went to their adult class. And then we would go into the regular service, and I didn't pay much attention to everything. It was nice, but lots of times as I got into junior high and high school, while the minister was talking, I was thinking about who I was going to ask out on a date, and girls and sports, and and I became a competitive swimmer, and so I really didn't pay a whole lot of attention to that. But the interesting thing is, my dad actually was the head of the official board, I think they called it, of the church, which was one of the biggest churches in Topeka, and my great grandfather, Hugh Dunn Fisher, actually wrote the book, The Gun and the Gospel. And that was the story of Quantrill's Raid, which was the big massacre that occurred in Lawrence, Kansas. And he was one that they were trying to catch and so forth. So we've always had a history of the Methodist Church. My dad was the head of the official board. But I never once heard my dad say a prayer. He was always there, always a nice guy, but he was busy. And all my life, he never hugged me. My dad never did hug me. He finally, the day that I got married, shook hands with me. But he was always there. He paid for my education and did everything and was very kind, but never did. So my faith was one that was just kind of there. And as time went on, my wife and I got married, and she joined the Methodist Church. And at that time, I began to watch Billy Graham movies or TV shows. And I kept thinking all the time, boy, I would like to be able to walk forward. So, I would watch it, and my faith would kind of grow and so forth. And then after it would get over, and I'd wake up the next day, I'd take my life back, and I, wasn't really, that was nice and so forth. But then I would just go ahead. I never did anything bad, really. Just normal kid stuff and so forth. But I would take it back. And sometimes I would be so concerned about my faith that I would get on my bicycle. My wife and I had bicycles, and sometimes when she was busy, I would go out, on an evening or an afternoon and go for a bike ride. And I would just kind of pray and say, God, I really don't understand what this is all about. But please guide me and give me directions. And then I would come back and then forget about it. Well, one day, and it was June 1st, 1969, Bill Glass, who was the defensive end of the Cleveland Browns, came to Topeka and came to our church. And he was conducting a revival in the big fairgrounds, which they had a huge stadium and everything else in the fairgrounds. And he was going to conduct a revival. Well, since our church was the biggest church in Topeka, really, or at least one of them, and it was the only one that was live broadcast on WIBW radio, which went all over the state of Kansas and part of Nebraska, Missouri, and Oklahoma. And so he picked our church to give the sermon. So he did. And so when the sermon was over, I asked Kathy. She was a competitive swimmer. In fact, I was her swimming coach. That's how I met her. She was on the Shawnee Country Club swimming team. And so that's how I met her. And everybody used to joke and say, Dave never let anybody get away with anything except Kathy. And she got away with the coach. But anyway, from that standpoint, I told her, I said, Kathy, I'd like to go to that revival tomorrow, and I'd just like to walk forward. And she said, Dave, really? I've got a water safety instructor class. I can't go, but if you really want to, I'll get a babysitter and you can go. And I said, well, this would be an opportunity to do something like Billy Graham. So she said, okay. So I remember the next day, which was Monday. And as I was going about my day and my regular insurance business and so forth, in the back of my mind, I was thinking about going to this revival. So finally the time came, we had dinner, and Kathy said, okay, that's my wife's name. She said, okay, I've got a sitter. She'll be here shortly, and you can go ahead and take off. And she said, then when the sitter gets here, I'll go get my water safety instructor's studies done and the course she was doing. So I said, okay, so I left. And I drove to the big arena, that kind of thing, and it was in the fairgrounds, and I walked under the breezeway. And when I walked under there, all of a sudden I started feeling very self-conscious. I was there all by myself, and everybody was staring at me. And what is this guy doing? I was kind of a businessman that people knew, and I probably had at that time 500 clients and so forth. And so I thought, well, what would people think? Here I am. So I didn't know what to do, but I stayed. And I walked up and I looked, and there was our minister up there with a couple of other people in the balcony. And boy, I was always afraid of the minister. He'd think I did something wrong or something. So I went clear up in the corner and sat all by myself. So Bill Glass gave the same basic sermon that he gave at the First Methodist Church. And when it was all over, he said, now we're going to sing a song. And he said, all of those that would like to come forward and give their life to Christ to walk forward. Well, I couldn't walk forward. And I tried, but I just could not. I was too embarrassed. I just couldn't do it. And that was why I was there. So I just sat there, and they finally finished the song. And I thought to myself, Dave, you blew it. You didn't walk forward. That's why you came. You just blew it. And Bill Glass said, there are people that really wanted to walk forward but didn't. So we're going to sing one more verse and give people the opportunity that wanted to walk forward and didn't to walk forward. So they started, and something caused me to because remember, it was in the bleachers. Something caused me to step one step down, and all of a sudden I realized it would look worse if I took a step down and then came back. So I continued to walk down, and I probably had 20 rows or so forth, and I walked down, and there was a crowd in front of the kind of the podium area of the stage, and where Bill Glass was giving his talk and so forth, sermon. And there was a crowd right down there. And so I walked, and I thought, oh gosh. And as I walked in, literally the back of my neck burned. I felt that every eye was on me. I have never been so self-conscious in my life. I just felt terrible. So anyway, I got there, and I thought, okay, I did it. And he said, we're going to give, when you're here, we're going to give you some literature, but we want you to leave, walk through the breezeway under the grandstand. There will be counselors there, and you'll go into a special area, and you'll meet with a counselor. We'll give you some literature, and then you can go home. And nobody is to leave their seats until everybody has filed out. Well, there was no way I was going to do that. So I got at the back of the group, and as I was clear back, I just kind of hung back, thinking kind of almost my head was down, afraid people were looking at me and so forth, because I was so self-conscious. And I walked through that breezeway, and everybody was pulling into, they were just pulling right in and so forth, where they were supposed to be going, and I went straight. I was on my way to my car, but there was a little voice that said, Dave, sir, did you walk forward? And I looked over, and there was a little farmer type person whose sleeve, he had on a sport coat, but his sleeve only came down kind of about like that. In other words, it didn't even go down to his wrist. And I said, I walked forward, but I've got to go home. I can't remember what the excuse was. He said, would you please go under the stands with me just for a minute? And I said, well, okay. So I walked out of the grandstand, and as I walked out of the grandstand, I looked, and here were all these people. They had individual chairs. And they were each person and a counselor was there with each person, and they were on their knees praying. And I thought, oh, I got to get out of here. What am I going to do? But the little guy, I couldn't turn him down. So it was just the one. If it had been a big businessman, I'd have just said, I'm sorry, I got to go. But it was him. So anyway, he said, would you like to get on your knees and we'll say a prayer? And I said, okay. So I got on my knees, and he said something like, God, thank you so much for this person walking forward, and said several different things along those lines and so forth. And he said, then would you like to say a little prayer? Well, I'd never said a prayer in front of anybody, but I didn't know what to say. So I said, Father, I have no idea what's happening, but thy will be done. And then we got up and we sat on the chair. He read several Bible verses. He asked me if I had a Bible. Oh, yeah, when I was in junior high, my church gave me a Bible and so forth. Okay, what church do you go to? Wrote down a few things and so forth. And then he said, after, about maybe 15 minutes, he said, okay. He said, now, before you leave, I said, would you like to say another little prayer? And I said, well, okay. So we got down, and he said another prayer. And then he turned around and he said, okay, now, he said, would you like to say a prayer? No idea what to say. So I said, Father, I have no idea what's happening, but thy will be done. And we got up, and I walked out, and I walked through the breezeway. And I walked through the breezeway. It was if I had absolutely no thought whatsoever on my mind. It was just completely, totally blank. I got in the car. I drove home. Not a thought went in there. I parked, went in the house. And the first thing Kathy said was, Dave, did you walk forward? And I said, yes. She said, I can't believe you did that. She didn't care, but that was her comment. And then we never talked about it again. we went, briefly talked, and it was getting kind of late, so we went to bed. The next morning, I got up, went into the bathroom, got out my shaving gear, put on my shaving cream and so forth, got out the razor, put the razor up to my head just like this, and dropped the razor in the sink. And right then and there, it was revealed to me, Jesus is the Son of God. And I have never had a question since then. It was something that was so incredibly dynamic that it just touched me in such a big, big way. And for the next probably 6 months, every appointment that I went on, I usually had 1 or 2 in the afternoon and 1 or 2 in the evening. And a lot of them were with college people because I was just out of college. And everyone that I went to, I told them that story. And people were really fascinated, but I just couldn't shut up because it was such an incredible, there's no way of describing it. It wasn't as big, I'm sure, as when Paul was on the road to Damascus, because I didn't go blind or something like that. But I mean, it was just something that it was an absolute, and to this day, I tell people kind of to catch them just for a second, but the way I say it is, what I say is, I don't believe Jesus is the Son of God. I know he is. And it's just an amazing thing. Funny thing about it, many things happened after that. But I want to say a few more things about my faith. But before I do, I want to go and jump clear to 2015, because that was back in the 1970s and so forth. And so in 2015, I had just gotten back from my second Joan of Arc pilgrimage. And I now had an iPad and an iPhone and so forth. And so when I got back, they were about 10 days of pilgrimage where we went all the places that Joan of Arc went in France. And when I got back, I always got my iPad out and I checked to see if any of my clients had died, because if they had, I immediately wanted to call and help them with the claim forms and so forth. And nobody had died, which I'm happy about and so forth. Most of my clients were still fairly young, but some of them were older. And I got to the point where there was no obituaries whatsoever. So I was great, went to bed that night. The next morning, I got up. And I think this was July 2nd of 2015. And I looked in the obituary, and my friend, his name is Jack Hahn, who was the number 2 people at the Kansas retirement system. Jack Hahn had passed away. And I thought, oh my gosh, Jack's one of my really good clients and so forth. And I just felt terrible, but I had an appointment. So I went to the appointment, and I thought, as soon as the appointment is over, I will go ahead and call Val Hahn, his wife, and tell her how sorry I am, and arrange to get together and fill out the claim forms and so forth. And as I was pulling, it was 11:30, and pulling into this big bank building, all of a sudden, my phone rang. And I looked at it, and it said, Jack Hahn. And I thought, oh, well, it can't be Jack. It must be his wife. So I picked up the phone, and I said, hello? And she said, hi, Dave, this is Val Hahn. And I said, well, hi, Val. I said, I was just going to call you. I was on my way to an appointment. I heard about Jack. I was going to call you as soon as the appointment was over. We need to get together and fill out the claim forms. And she said, okay. But she said, Dave, would you do me a favor? And I said, sure. And she said, would you conduct his funeral? I said, what? She said, would you conduct his funeral? I said, oh, I said, don't you have a minister? And she said, we did. We had a strong faith, but we had a falling out with the church. And she said, when Jack years ago said, when I die, I want Dave Fisher to conduct his funeral. I'm sure that was because I told him about my experience in the bathroom with the revelation that Jesus is the Son of God. So you never know when little things like that will pop up. And it's kind of an exciting thing when those things happen. So anyway, that's kind of a little bit of the story of kind of how I got started. Now, once I did that, and went to the Billy Graham crusade and so forth. Jesus was revealed to me. Then in the summer of 1971, I was called. Well, I was the president of the swimming club, and I got called right in the middle of the meeting. And I had told my wife not to bother me, but she stopped me and said, "Dave, just a minute. You need to take this call." So I did, and it was from the First Methodist Church. And the person said, "Dave, would you conduct the lay sermon at our church?" I said, oh my gosh. I said, is this the one that's going to be on the radio? And she said, yes. I said, oh my gosh. Well, don't you have somebody else? No, you've been the one we would like to have. I'd never done anything like that before. And so I said, well, okay. So I gave the sermon, and the title of the sermon was Try It. It's exciting. And for a long time, I started getting letters because it went over Kansas. It went over all of Kansas, even out in western Kansas, and it went out to up to Nebraska and little parts of beyond Kansas City and so forth, and down in Oklahoma. And I got just notes and so forth thanking me for the sermon, because I don't know why my minister, Dr. Watts, the same guy that was up there in the bleachers, the same person, wrote me a letter, and he said it was probably one of the finest red lay sermons that had ever been delivered in the First United Methodist Church. So
wow, and it was called Try It. It's exciting.
Try It. It's exciting, yeah.
And just give us a little. I'm just dying to know, what were you wanting people to try? What's exciting?
Try God's way. In other words, try. And I started out with the excitement. I like to always start my speeches where people don't have any idea what I'm going to talk about. And I remember the start of that. I said, they said it was a perfect day. The sky was the deepest blue of anywhere you could imagine. The sun was warm, but not hot. The conditions were perfect. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. And suddenly there was a sound of thunder as a red, white, and blue streak darted across the Kansas sky, followed by another and another and another, until a total of 6. And then I go on and say, as the United States Air Force Thunderbird flight demonstration team performed at Forbes Air Force Base in Topeka, Kansas. And it was exciting. Then I talked about people getting excited about football games and basketball games and baseball games, and even women get excited about bridge clubs and so forth. Why aren't people excited about Jesus Christ and what God has done for them? And that was basically what the sermon was all about. Then I gave examples, and I would talk about various Bobby Richardson, the famous New York Yankees shortstop, and a lot of other people, and about their faith and so forth. And at the end, I found a little group. One of my clients belonged to a church, and they sang a song called Try It, Try It, Try It, Try God's Way. And so I had them play that and sing it as a group out of our church. And that was the first time that anyone had ever done anything in the First Methodist Church. Now they do it all the time. So anyway, yeah. So try it, try God's way. So anyway, that's kind of where that started. Then a couple of years later, Dr. Watts called me. And he said, Dave, would you be, I think I was 32 or 33, something like that. Would you represent young adults? Because the EUB church is we're kind of combining the First Methodist Church, all Methodist churches, with the EUB, and it was going to be called the United Methodist Church. So I said, well, okay. So I sat through and listened to all these experts talking about all the benefits and so forth. And then when it came time to vote, I went ahead and voted, and obviously it was a success. And now the Methodist Church is called the United Methodist Church. And I remember one of the things that when I was on one of the Joan of Arc pilgrimages, to show you a little bit about faith and so forth, when I was over in France, one of the things we did was stay in monasteries. Everything was Joan of Arc. Everything was faith-based. And so one of the most wonderful, I've been 5 times. And the guy just wrote me today an email and said, we're just putting the one next year. Do you think you would like to go next year? And I might. Who knows? If I took my granddaughter one time a couple of years ago, just before COVID. So I might go back again. But anyway, one of the things we did was we went into the cathedral where Joan of Arc went and prayed in Orléans, France. They pronounce it Orléans. And what we did is we stayed in a monastery, and then we turned around. This is an interesting story. We turned around and we would leave the monastery, drive to the big church on Sunday. Well, he had all these connections. We only had a group of about, I think the smallest group was 5 and the largest was 11. But really a wonderful pilgrimage. And they had all the connections. So we would go in and a person would meet us, and we would go down below under the whole church, this huge, great, big Catholic church. And we would go down under there and we would go through the Roman ruins. I didn't even know Rome was there, but the ruins were there, but it was. And we would go and see where they were excavating and doing these things. In one place, they even said, whether it's true or not, I don't know, that they had a splinter from Jesus's cross. I doubt that's true, but they swear that it is. But anyway, and so we spent an hour down there. Then we went up, and instead of down below, we went up and climbed way, way, way up into the top of the church. I mean, it was sometimes it was so narrow. Fortunately, I wasn't real heavy or something, so I could squeeze through. But we go up to way up there and look out with the gargoyles and everything else. And we would look down at the regular cathedral where the people would be, and the chairs were just like little dots. And we would spend about an hour getting all. It took a long time to get up there, and so then we'd walk back down, and then we'd go to the Catholic church, and we would go to the service. Well, the minister, who was the priest, was a very nice guy, and he knew we were on a Joan of Arc pilgrimage, and so he gave everybody, even though we weren't Catholic, he gave us all communion. And so it was really, which was very touching to me. I mean, it really meant something. And he was just such a wonderful guy. So the whole process was about an hour. This is where it gets amazing. Then we left from there. We walked just across a little courtyard to his home. And we went into his home we walked in the door. And as we walked in the door, I noticed that just inside the door was a restroom. It was just like a house, a restroom. And I thought, well, maybe I'll want to use that. We have been, for almost 3.5 hours, since we used it the last time. But we walked through there, through the kitchen, through the dining area, out through part of the living room, and then out onto the patio, which was covered. And there was a beautiful banquet for us that the parishioners had put together, that they did every year for us. But it was a huge banquet, and cheeses and so forth. And of course, the Catholics always have to have a little wine, and the French do, and so forth. So they had this, and all of a sudden I thought, before I start with the banquet, I'm going to go back and use the restroom. So I didn't tell anybody. And I walked back, and I walked through the living room and the dining room and through the kitchen, and I went in, walked to the front door, and I walked into the bathroom, and I went in and locked the door. And I used the restroom. And after I used the restroom, I washed my hands off, and it's just a regular home towel and so forth. So I just used the towel, wiped my hands off and so forth. And then I went over and unlocked the door, and it wouldn't unlock. And I grabbed the door and the handle and so forth, and I grabbed it as hard as I could and twisted, and it would not unlock. And I began to panic. There I was. Nobody could hear me. They were clear out, on the other side of the house outside. They wouldn't know. What am I going to do? And besides that, I don't even speak. I do speak a little French, but very little. And I didn't much then. And I thought, what am I going to do? I could yell, scream. They won't hear me. What am I going to do? Everybody's out there and I'm here. And all of a sudden I thought, I know what I'll do. And I got the towel because I could get more. And remember, I could do chin-ups and push-ups and all that kind of stuff. So I wasn't weak. And I grabbed that towel and I put it on the door and I twisted as hard as I could, and it would not unlock. And I stepped back probably about 4 feet, and I said, God, what am I going to do? Heard a click. Reached out, turned the knob, and walked back into the patio. And I was amazed. I wrote that whole story down in my iPhone that same day, word for word, because I never wanted to exaggerate that story. But it's just an amazing thing. The title of my book was He's Here. And that was just another example that I use about God is here. And so it's, So that's another one of the amazing stories. But anyway, I was asked to be the lay service and so forth. And then I was also asked into with the EUB church. And so everything was just kind of, my wife would go, and then we moved. And when we moved, my wife was not real happy with the minister. I don't know what exactly happened, but she said, Dave, now that we've moved, still in the same city, I've just moved to a different house. She said, I really don't think I want to go to church. And I said, oh, well, and I didn't want to just go off to church by myself. So I thought, well, what do you want to do? She said, she was a school teacher. And she said, I just want to spend Sunday morning out on the patio or on the screened in porch, read the newspaper, have coffee, and just relax. I've had, just kind of unwind before I go back. And I said, well, okay. So we did. So we didn't go back to church on a regular basis. Every once in a while I would say, Kathy, what do you want to do for Father's Day? And I'd say, I'd really like to go to church. So we would go. And I remember going to church and I would get tears rolling down my cheeks because, there I was back where I wanted to be. But I also was deeply in love with my wife. She was my best friend and companion. It was just the most wonderful person that you could imagine, and the mother of our 3 children and so forth. So anyway, we would do that. Well, finally, it got to the point that Kathy found out that she had bile duct cancer. And when she found out that she had bile duct cancer, we spent about 11 months fighting it. And we even got to the point where she was going to have a liver transplant. I was too old to give her a liver transplant, but all three of our children, our two boys and our daughter, all three of them offered to give her part of their liver. So she was all set. And the middle boy, Shane is his name. He won. So he actually was going to be giving her part of his liver. He'd gone to it was all done through the Mayo Clinic. I think we went 4 or 5 times up there. One time we spent over almost 3 weeks up there while she was going through the chemotherapy and all this type of thing. I don't remember exactly the time. But anyway, so we were all set, and he was all set to go up, and he'd gone for his physical and everything, and they had a complete match, so everything was going to be fine. And then just before we were to go up there for the transplant, why, it came out again, and she had a sore spot on her side, and it turned out the cancer had spread, so she couldn't. So we had to come back, and at that particular, we never went back there for that, though we did go back for another checkup and found out there was nothing else she could do. And that was in November of 2010. So we did everything we could possibly, and so forth. She got weaker and weaker and weaker, and finally she died on January the 14th of 2011. And I remember I laid my cheek right next to hers when she took her last breaths. And I just told her all the time, Kathy, I said, Jesus loves you. God loves you. You're so lucky because you're about ready to go see him. And she took a big breath, and then that sighed, and then another big breath, sighed, and it was perfectly silent. And I remember just feeling her right there for just a second. And it almost felt like something left. It almost is, I don't know, but almost that her spirit left. And when it left, why, it was, all of a sudden, of course, I'd had plenty of time to get prepared for it, with all the time and so forth. But at the same time, it was said, well, one of the things that happened after the funeral, before she had died, the minister came one time to visit. And it was getting pretty close. And he walked me out. I walked him out to the door after he'd made his call. And I said, when this is all over, I'd like to have the opportunity of, I'd like to go back to church again. You know what he said? Nothing. Never said a word. And I realize now he didn't want to try and talk me into coming back. He wanted me to be the one that came back. So after the funeral and so forth, and I had to meet with the hospice people, they wanted to make sure I was doing okay. My faith was so strong that I felt that Kathy, that was God's will. And Kathy, even though I miss her dearly, that's what was God's will. So from that standpoint, I was broken. I'll never forget. A couple of days after my son left, he stayed with me for a couple of days. I was walking up the stairs to the upper stairs. In fact, I'm looking at them right now. And as I walked up, all of a sudden it hit me, and I collapsed on the stairs, and I just started crying. And all of a sudden I said, God, now I know what weeping and wailing is all about. And I wailed and cried. And then all of a sudden, this peace came over me. And I just felt the presence of God, and I knew everything was okay. And from then on, everything was fine. Well, a few days later, I went to the church and joined a Sunday school class. And then the minister called me up, and he said, Dave, he said, would you be willing to serve as our representative, one of 2 representatives for the United Methodist Annual Conference, and represent our church? And I said, sure, I'll be glad to. And he said, I did that because I know you have control over your own schedule. And the other person was one of the state representatives for Kansas. Her first name was Annie. So we got to be pretty good friends. And so I went to the meeting. And I'll never forget, when I went to the meeting, we were going in the conference, there was some discussion going on about pride. And I didn't even know what it was all about. So I walked through the door, and somebody offered me a pride pin. And I refused it. I wondered, what in the world are doing something like that? That's ridiculous. Well, I sat there in the meetings, and I began to realize that there were people that were talking about the pride, of LGBTQ, and how they shouldn't be able to get married in the church, and how they shouldn't be able to be ministers, and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, I don't know anything about this. This is, I just thought it was all ridiculous. And LGBT, and I always thought, if it doesn't work, if you can't have babies together, it doesn't work. That's not God's will. So I thought, well, this is just ridiculous. So then I began to think about it more, and I thought, well, if I'm going to vote, I better start learning about it, because they didn't take a vote that year. It was the next year that they voted. So for 1 year, I started trying to study, and I realized there was more than just LGB, but there was LGBTQ, so forth. And I was fascinated by the transgenders, and I thought that's the hardest one to understand there is. So I started watching videos. I went online, got YouTube videos, but most of the videos I watched were TED Talks. Good videos. I mean, they weren't raunchy things or so, where they were good and they were honest. And I read books. And one of my heroes growing up was Bruce Jenner. And Bruce was just an outstanding athlete and won the decathlon, and he was kind of my idol. And I even I did some pole vaulting and ran the quarter mile and all that kind of stuff. So, and I was a swimmer. And so I was kind of an athlete in college and so forth. So, although I didn't do the pole vault, well, a little bit in college, but anyway, so he was my idol, and I heard that was transitioning. It was Caitlyn Jenner, and I thought, no, this is ridiculous. So I got his book and his story, and I read it, and I thought, I just don't understand this. But he told the story about how when he won the gold medal, he went up into his room. And when he went up into his room, there was a full-length mirror, and it was his own private room, and a full-length mirror, and he took off all of his clothes, and he hung the gold medal around his neck, and he looked in the mirror, and he said, that isn't me. I'm a girl. That's not me. And then he would put on girls' clothes when it got dark at night, and then he would go out and walk, because he said he had to just relieve himself of the pressures of not being able to be who he really was. Well, I called my sister, who's a therapist in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I told her, what do you know about transgender people? And she said, well, not a whole lot. And I said, would you read Caitlyn Jenner's book? I'll send it to you. Would you read it and let me know what you think? So she did. And she said, yeah, Dave, this is really true. There really are people like that. So I reread it again, and all of a sudden it began to make sense. And I began to realize, and I began to empathize and sympathize with these people. I have this incredible, feelings of just empathy for people. So I put together a whole bunch of videos, and they were 2 hours long, and I put little videos together. And I thought, I'm going to show my Sunday school class. So I showed the Sunday school class, because we were all concerned about the church splitting and so forth. So I showed them, and I was 2 hours long, so I showed them 1 hour. And in the process of that, when we were looking at it in the videos, I looked at everybody, and they were fascinated. And when it was all over, everybody just said, thank me for it, because we did it in 2 different Sunday school Sundays, and they thanked me for it. Well, lo and behold, about a week later, I get a call from a lady who was kind of in charge of the LGBTQ group in our church, and she said, Dave, would you show those videos to our church and to make it available? And I said, well, sure, I guess. So they scheduled it. Well, COVID hit, so they delayed it for a while, even though I showed it to my video or my civic club, and then I showed it, and it was very well received. So I started thinking, I need to do something about it. I thank God is directing me to help people to understand transgenders. And because I could just feel their feelings, just kind of like I felt the feelings of Joan of Arc and the feelings of Kathy Fiscus and all those people and so forth. And so I thought, I just need to do something. I prayed about it, asked God, what should I do? And everything seemed to be the direction. Dave, people don't understand. You need to do something about it. So that's kind of what I have almost dedicated my life to over the last probably 4 or 5 years, is learning more and more about it and helping people to understand that transgender people are real. And one of the fascinating things, and I wrote in my little paper, Guide to Understanding the Transgender Mystery, one of the fascinating things that I discovered was that so many of them, not the ones that are the arguing, you've got to call me by my right name, or I'm never going to call you by the right name, but the 80 to 90% in the center, they're just genuine people. And I discovered that those people, many of them, can see the world from both the male and the female perspective. And people that once they can do that, then they're more gentle and more kind about everybody's understanding. So that fascinated me on transgender people and how they're how they interact in the world. And I think if everybody could understand and see the world from the male and female perspective, it might be a whole different world. And then I came across, there's a guy that wrote a book called What is a Woman? And that was something that seemed to be somewhat controversial because he was just on one side. So I kind of wrote that little blurb that's in A Guide to Understanding the Transgender Mystery, trying to help people to realize. And I used the example of the YMCA, which I coached the Y for 11 years, the swimming team, and started out with 15 boys and ended up with 115 boys and girls. And most of the time I was the only coach. But anyway, they had a slogan, the Y, of mind, body, and spirit. And I began to think about what we are really made of is we all have a mind, we all have a body, and we all have a spirit. And the spirit really is, to me, the spirit probably is the soul. I mean, they call it, the Y called it the spirit, but it seems to me it's the soul. And so I began to think, what really controls everything? Well, the soul is what God has given us, but the mind is what causes the body to act. So I began to realize that transgender people, it's the mind that is the one that tells them that they should transgender. And one of the biggest problems was understanding, what was meant by gender dysphoria, because that was something I had a hard time grasping. And finally, after talking to a lot of people and listening to a lot of stories, I realized that it was a way to understand it, which helped me, was, I know we've all had this experience before, but have you ever gone on vacation? And you go on vacation, and we've loaded up the family and so forth, and get about 100 miles out, and all of a sudden I turned to my wife and I said, Kathy, did we close the garage door? She said, I don't know. And I said, I don't remember. And I asked the kids, did we close the garage? Nobody knew. From that point on, I really was not in tune with what I was doing, because in the back of my mind, I was constantly thinking about, is that garage door closed? So I lost all my concentration. I could drive the car, but I lost the concentration. And then I discovered that that's what happens with transgender people. Their mind is knowing who they are, but the mirror and their friends and everyone else thinks they're somebody else, and their mind can't put it together. And so they can go to movies and watch the movie and come out, and they kind of know what happened. And 2 or 3 days later, they can say, I was talking to my wife, or I was talking to my husband about the movie, and I can't remember what happened. And it was because their mind was really working like in a continuous loop in a computer, where it's going around, it's building up the heat and everything else, and so forth, because they just can't concentrate. And once they transition, then they're able to concentrate, and then the gender dysphoria seems to go away. But then they have all these people that criticize them and tell them they're wrong, and there's a men in a dress, or a man this and that and the other, and it gets to be a really sad situation. And that's why I think it's so important for people to understand that transgender people are just people, and just like all of us, and that they have the same lively needs that we all have, and so forth, for companionship and love and caring. But it's definitely has nothing to do with sex. It is just purely with who a person is. So that's kind of what I did. I even wrote a book, and it's a really interesting murder mystery. And I can't tell you the genre of it, but it's a murder mystery, but it's titled Who Killed Who? A Love Story. And it's the most amazing story. I wrote it down. I actually almost became one of the characters. And my best friend, who's a judge of the Court of Appeals in Colorado, he is one of the parts, though they're all make-believe and so forth. Though part of it's a true story. But in there is a lot of things that I think that people would learn a lot about if they read the book. And it was so popular that even though it's just word of mouth, because I published it just on Amazon and Apple and so forth, but it was so popular that I made it into a paperback, because all the others were ebooks. And I'm now, it's the proofreaders right now, but I wrote a follow-up called Who Stole What? A Love Story. So I've tried to do different things in different ways to help people to somehow grasp, the truth. I belong to a literary club. And in the literary club, it's made up of doctors, lawyers, judges, accountants, salespeople, school teachers, college professors, a whole bunch of group people. And I gave a talk on the transgender mystery. And I'll never forget when I gave it, and I gave all kinds of examples. Some of the videos I showed in Sunday school, one a very good one, Caitlyn Jenner and so forth like that. One I covered the swimmer that from Pennsylvania and so forth, covered all of that. And the next time we meet once a month. And I had a person call me up the next day and he said, Dave, half of our group are really strong Republicans. So they thought, what is Dave Fisher doing talking about transgenders? And he said, then they turned around and said, after I heard he's talking, he said, I kind of think I see what he's talking about. And so, well, this guy called up and he stopped me at the next meeting. And he said, Dave, he said, I just wanted to thank you. Very few people would have the guts to get out in front of a group like this and talk about understanding transgender people. He said, thank you so much for what you did. So I've had all kinds of things that have done like that. And anybody that ever wants to talk about it, I'm always there to try and answer the question. I don't tell anybody how they should feel. I just want them to realize what it is. And when it comes to church, there's a lot of transgender people that are very strong Christians. I'm a strong Christian, obviously. And I feel that transgender people are just normal people, and the ones that I've studied and so forth love God and love Jesus and so forth, and they just want to be allowed to have their faith. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So anyway, it may bring up some questions or something, but that'll give you a little bit of my story and I guess why I made the comment that I did on your podcast, and when I came back and said, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. And the only reason that they could find to burn her at the stake was because she wore men's clothes. And the interesting thing about it is what happened was a couple of days before, I guess it was the day before, they took her out because they told her that we're going to burn you at the stake unless you repent and say that the St. Michael, St. Catherine, St. Margaret didn't speak to you and didn't tell you, go, 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 daughter of God, which led you to get the king crowned, King Charles VII and so forth. And you've got to repent and say you didn't hear it. And finally, they brought her out there and showed her the stake and everything. And the poor little thing, 19 years old, just was in tears, didn't know what. Finally, she thought, well, at least they'll take me out of the men's prison. They'll put me in the women's prison, and maybe I'll get to go home back to my little cottage in Del Remy sometime. And so she repented. Well, they took her back, and guess what they did? They took her in the men's prison. They chained her onto a big block of wood. Sometimes they had her stand with a collar around her so that she couldn't lay down in a cage. And a little 17, 18, 19-year-old girl was what was going through this and so forth. They took her back and they put her in this room and they said, now, don't you ever wear men's clothes again or you're going to be burned at the stake. Well, she said that night that something happened and that God was very, very disappointed in her because he said, you said that this was not true. And she prayed and she asked God with all of her heart and all of her mind to please forgive her. Well, the next morning, she woke up. Well, she was worried. In fact, it happened in the middle of the night. She woke up. When she got up, one of the things on a table, they had put men's clothes in her room, just right there. Well, she was worried because all it was these rough old guards and men and so forth like that. And she was worried because these were rough people that were running the prisons and so forth. And she was worried. And so she finally, to save herself from being raped, and we don't know whether she was raped or not. Nobody knows the answer to that, but she put on the men's clothes. Well, the next day, Pierre Couchon, who was the Bishop of Beauvais, who was in charge of the whole thing, walks in with some of his people and so forth, and she had on men's clothes. And she just for saving herself. So she said, okay, that's it, to the stake. And so they took her out. They did let her take communion and met with a priest first, and then she went out. And that's a sad story as she goes out, and this poor little girl goes out, 19 years of age. They shaved her head. They had done everything. And many of the movies turn around and they say that she wore white, a white frock. She didn't. It was black. And she wore that. And of course, they took her out and they burned her at the stake. And when they burned her at the stake, why, I'll never forget what she said, because they started the fire. And most people think that she burned up, which she did, but she didn't burn up. She didn't die that way. What happened was that there is such a tremendous amount of smoke and the air that comes up with this tremendous fire that she suffocated. There was no air, and she fell over and died. Well, there was a mean old, you may have heard in the story I read, there's a mean old guard that kept calling her a harlot and all kinds of things and so forth. And he actually passed out. And they took him back to to a pub, and they asked him, what in the world happened? And when he came back, he said, when she died, he said, I saw a white dove fly out of her mouth. And that was an amazing thing. And, God, remember Jesus when remember the Holy Spirit and the dove when came down and so forth. So evidently there's just so much of it that is just absolutely incredible. And going to where Joan of Arc was in Do Re Mi and going behind her home, right there, I remember when she was talking, she talked about, that she would be in her backyard and tending her father's garden. And all of a sudden, she would hear the voices of St. Michael and St. Catherine and St. Margaret telling her, go, 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 daughter of God, and told her she was going to go to get the king crowned and so forth. And she said it always came, the voices came from the church, and there was always a bright light. And she would turn around, and there's the church. And when I went behind her yard, and I thought about that, or her house, I thought about that and turned, and there was the church. So it was just amazing to go to the various places that were so much of her life. And I used to go by myself on the pilgrimage. I would sometimes get up early and I would walk. It was only just a block or two. Do Re Mi is a tiny little town. Walk a block or two and walk behind her house and just sit there and pray and just think. And it was just such an incredible experience that God has given me to go and actually be there where Joan of Arc lived and where she led the army and where she got the king crowned, and then of course where she was burned at the stake. So very touching. So anyway,
Joan, I love that. And that's a connection we have because I've always loved Joan of Arc. She's been one of my favorite people. I love Mark Twain's biography of her. It's incredible. And she was so misunderstood, which is kind of brings us to talking about how transgender people are so misunderstood, and maybe why, you also feel a connection with them. So, but my question about that, because we even have people who are watching right now who are believing that the Bible or Jesus is against being transgender. So what do you say to people when they say, but what does Jesus say about this?
Well, I can't speak for Jesus, but what I do know is that when Jesus came back, a lot of the old laws and so forth were written for the people back in the times where, they thought the earth was flat, that if they went out in the ocean, they're going to fall off. They had all kinds of rules and regulations, like you can't wear two kinds of clothing, because if you do, of course, there was a reason for that, because when you wash them, they shrink at different rates and things like that. But they would also say that, for example, that women have to cover their heads before they go into church. Women can't wear men's clothes. There were a lot of these rules that were set up as they were trying to form the first church. Now, one of the things that I'm a little bit different Christian than some people, in that my foundation of everything is on that June 3rd, 1969, because it was revealed to me that Jesus is the Son of God. I go to church, two churches every Sunday, one at 9 o'clock, and then I go to my main church at 10:45. So I go to two church services. I listen to the scriptures and so forth, and like that. But I don't read the Bible very much. I've read it all. I've listened to it on tape. But I don't need the reinforcement so much, because I already know that Jesus is the Son of God. I know that God is God, and I have experienced the fellowship with the Holy Spirit. So it's kind of like reading a book over and over again. The Bible is so full of important information that I get my benefits by going to these two church services. So I hear it about about 104 times a year, different versions of the scripture, and I read a little bit. I mean, I won't say nothing, and I go to funerals and stuff. But my power is in the fellowship with Jesus and with God. Now, my biggest prayer is a prayer you've never probably ever heard of. I always pray. I pray every day before I eat, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'm driving in the car, and I may pray to God. I just feel like I don't follow Jesus. I feel Jesus is with me all the time. We're walking this. He's walking with me through this adventure of life. But my prayer is, God, please put everything in the right perspective. And please. So when something comes up and I have a decision to make, then I always say, God, please put it in the right perspective for me, the way you want me to act, because I believe God speaks to every person differently, and that there is nothing. The only Christian is, there was no Christian church. That came after Jesus died and so forth. That's when we really formed the churches. There were, the old churches and so forth, and the Jewish churches, but that's when the Christianity really started going and so forth. So I look at the Bible and I say, every individual, if a person doesn't know whether they're doing the right thing or not, pray, ask God. I'm one of these people that when it comes to abortion, my wife would have never wanted to have an abortion, but I feel that that's actually a person's decision with the person, their husband or the wife, depending on which one, both of them make the decision, probably their minister and so forth, and God, because there are certain circumstances and rape and something like that I'm not going to tell a person that they can't, have an abortion. I'm not going to it's not my decision. So I won't say yes or no. So I think it's their individual decision that they need to make on themselves, and talk to God and make that decision there. It's not something to take lightly, but there are circumstances. I'm a member of the Civitan Club, and one of our things that we do is we are help special needs people. And that's one we really do and so forth. That's one of our primary projects. Big association for special needs children and so forth. And one of the things that we learned is that whenever you have a child that is special needs, the divorce rate goes up dramatically. And the reason is that one of the parents takes a real liking to that child, and really that child becomes really more important than their spouse. And that's the reason a lot of them, I think the divorce rate's something like 50% anyway, on that, because so I always look at it and say, if the doctors say that there's going to be something seriously wrong and they feel that they want to have the abortion, I don't say I'm the person that's their decision, not mine and God. So kind of how I feel. So, but I would never tell anybody they can or can't, because that's up to them. I think your microphone's off.
Oh, sorry about that.
There you go.
Yeah. Well, now, what are some of the ideas that helped you as you were reading Bruce Jenner's book? What ideas helped you to realize that this was something you should support as far as transgender? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a hard way to say I should support. I guess emotionally. So one of the things, I just emotionally get involved with situations, and when I get in, I can almost feel like I'm in their shoes, and I feel so sorry for what they go through. And so with Bruce Jenner, once I read that again after my sister said, Dave, this is real. Once I closed, because so often as we get older, we close our mind and we're become opinionated. And when you have a closed mind and opinionated, then you don't look at it. You don't see the total picture and so forth, and make a decision. You're just following up. So much of the arguments is just going along with what everybody else says. Just like I did. I thought, transgenders and LGBTQ was ridiculous. If you couldn't have children, it didn't work, then that couldn't be God's will. But then I later realized that there's a lot more to it than that. So when I saw with Bruce Jenner, when I then saw him or heard the story where he was in front of the mirror, and here's this world champion, greatest athlete at his time that there ever was, the decathlon winner, and it meant so much to him. I said, Dave, he's kind of one of your idols. Maybe you don't think exactly like him, but it's got to be what it's like. And there's a really good, one of the movies that I did to the Literary Club actually shows Bruce Jenner in his car crying. Here's this great guy crying because people were criticizing him because of who he really was. But it was so important to him, he still had to go ahead and do it. And that's what's amazing. So Bruce Jenner, once I saw that he did it, that even made it even more real to me. That's the way it was. This I read her book. What's the lady that's new in the House of Representatives? Her name escapes me just right now. But she's transgender, and it's a big restroom thing, and so mm-hmm. I can't. But anyway, they made such a big thing. I read her book, and and all these things that she has gone through in her life, because she is just, she gets so much ridicule and so forth. And it's a beautiful story. Most people don't realize that she got married to another transgender, but it was a man. She got married to him a couple of days before he died of cancer, because they just wanted to get married so that when he died, they died as a couple. He died as a couple. It's just, there's me crying my head off and so forth, because it was just so touching. So when you get into the minds of the people that are going through this, then all of a sudden you realize, hey, what am I to be criticizing these people? And another thing kind of interesting, my son is a big Super Bowl fan, and Kansas City Chiefs are a pretty good football team, and they were going to be in the Super Bowl, and we were having a chili supper, and we were sitting next to an elderly lady, and my son and I were, and we were having chili, which went to help with the summer pilgrimage kind of thing that our youth do, to go out someplace like in Kentucky and build houses or something like that. And we sat there and we were talking, and all of a sudden she was saying, Dave, I'm really worried about the world right now and how everything is just kind of falling apart. We've got everybody at each other's mouths and arguing and so forth. And I said, well, I'm so concerned about it too. And I said, I'm really concerned because of the way he treats transgender people and the way the legislature and my state legislature are treating transgender people. It really bothers me. And I don't really know any transgender people. And she said, my son said, Dave, Dad, I got to go. I'm going to go to watch the Super Bowl and so forth. So we sat there for a little bit and we talked. And I said, I've never met any transgender people. So she said, she said, there's a church in town called Cafe Catesall Church. And I remembered that the minister there, who's a Methodist minister, had told about the church a couple of years before that in our church service. She gave a sermon. So I said, oh, that's interesting. She said, there are transgender people and LGBTQ people in the church there. Maybe you ought to just go sometime. So I did. And I went to the church service, and I didn't discuss anything. I saw a couple of people I thought might be transgender, but I wasn't sure. But I just, enjoyed the service and the sermon. That was a lady minister. So I went back and I thought, I really enjoyed that. Maybe that was at the same time as my Sunday school, and I was a Sunday school teacher, one of several. And I thought, maybe I'll go back another time. So I did. And I realized then I like this far better than the repetition I'm getting from my Sunday school class that I've gone for years and years and years, and they're just using a different author saying basically the same thing. I want to go to this other place. And so I prayed about it, and I said, God, I pick up a guy that is in his 90s and take him to Sunday school. I'm his ride. There's other people that could. And I said, I feel guilty about that. But at the same time, I feel that there is more for me in this other Sunday school class to learn. What should I do? I don't know what to do. And I waited a couple of days on it, and all of a sudden it just kind of hit me. Dave, go to this class that is going to nourish you the most, and not to go to something just because you're taking a person because they need a ride to church. He now has got another person that picks him up. So I've been going to that one since I think middle of March, and I have met some of the most wonderful transgender people. And there are two Methodist lady ministers, both of them, that are actually, one of them was beaten by her husband, and later, so they finally got divorced. And she told me, Dave, I fell in love with this other woman who was also a Methodist minister, and they got married. And they are two of the most nicest people you can ever imagine. So the key really is to just meet these people, because I think if a person thinks they shouldn't be transgender because God is really telling them that, they shouldn't be. But just because they look at an old scripture and they feel very comfortable and not like they're going against God's will, I can't see anything wrong with that at all. I really can't.
But yeah, especially, really and truly, the Bible does not say anything about it. So even if you are going to go strictly by what the Bible says, the Bible does not address the issue of being transgender. But one thing I do notice that the Bible says is it takes the focus off of gender. And, it says, in Christ, there is neither male nor female, slave nor free, Jew nor Gentile. You are all one in Christ Jesus. So this whole verse is talking about God is not looking at the outward things. God is looking at the heart. We are united in spirit. And so the there's a precedent for not being focused on something related to gender as being something that could separate you from God, or, that would make it something negative.
Yeah, that's right. And Jesus says when we go to heaven, we neither marry or are given in marriage, because I think that the soul really is neither male or female. It's just the life in the body, and depending on whether we were born and how we were born, whether we're a boy or a girl, or whether we have one mind in the body of another one. Now, here's another interesting thing, and lots of times I ask myself, why am I so compassionate? My wife sometimes would joke about it. I remember years ago, when I took a flight physical, because I used to fly little airplanes for a while. When I took a flight physical, why the doctor that gave that said, "Did you know you have a heart murmur?" And I said, "No, it's never been." Oh, he said, "It's functional, no problem at all. But you probably ought to have that just checked out just to be sure." So I thought, okay, so I made an appointment with a cardiologist and so forth. And I went there, and it was in the wintertime. And I was really kind of concerned, and I thought, well, what should I do about this? So I made the appointment, and in Topeka, Kansas, back in those days, they only had a few snowplows, and they didn't clean the streets. So we were on our own, and it snowed about pretty close to, I would say, almost a foot, which in Topeka is a big snow. But I had the appointment. And I told my wife, she said, "You better just call." I said, "Well, I really need to go to this appointment. It took a long time to get it." She said, "Okay." So I got in the car, and I drove down one street, and it was kind of tough, but I had snow tires on and so forth. And so real snow tires, I think they were anyway, all wheel anyway. So anyway, I went down this hill, and as I was going down this hill, all of a sudden, this main thoroughfare went by, and a snowplow went by, and I started crying. And I cried for about, I could hardly see. And I started crying, but I still went on down and went there. And I kind of followed the snowplow all the way down to where I needed to turn off and then go to the doctor's office and so forth. So I told Kathy afterwards, I said, strangest thing happened. I said, and I told her that same story. And she said, "Dave, why would you cry when you see a snowplow go by?" And I said, "Because he was helping people." And that's the compassion that I have. And that's why I have the compassion for these people, the transgenders. I still had a problem with the LGBT, the gays and lesbians, but then pretty soon I realized, well, Dave, they're just like the transgenders. They're people, God's children, just like everything else. And so I just feel like they're just God's children. We're all God's children. So now I'll tell you another little story that's kind of interesting that people don't realize, and I didn't either, but it's kind of when I wondered about my compassion, I kind of wondered about this. There was some stories about DES. Have you ever heard of that? Diethylstilbestrol. In 1948, they began to give women, this was back in 48, they began to give women diethylstilbestrol to help them from not having a miscarriage. And, especially if they were prone to that. And my mom and dad got married in 1938, and they planned on having a child 1 year later, because my dad was out of law school now and so forth. So he was practicing law, but they wanted to wait a year. Well, about 6 months or 9 months, something like that, I can't remember exactly, they were in a very bad car accident, and my mom's pelvis was broken. So she went to the doctor, and my dad knew the doctor fairly well, and he was very conservative. He made his patients, after they gave birth, they had to stay in bed for 1 week before they could even get out of bed to go to the bathroom. His theory was total recovery beforehand. Well, that was my mom's doctor. So anyway, he said to my mom, of course, this is a hearsay because I wasn't alive and kicking at that point, but he said to my dad and mom, "You can't have a child for a year because we just can't risk it." So anyway, after the year was up, then that's when I was conceived. And I'm almost positive, though I can't tell, my sister's almost positive too, but we really don't know, that my mom took DES. And they have found that I think it doubles the chance approximately of being transgender. So most people aren't transgender. In fact, the biggest real problem is breast cancer for women with this DES, diethylstilbestrol. But anyway, from that standpoint, and I always thought, well, maybe my mom took that, and maybe that's why I'm a little bit more compassionate about things, and so, and maybe why that's, a little bit more concerned about these people. I don't know. I would never will know. But that was one of the questions that I've always thought. I wonder if that could have anything to do with why I was so compassionate and why I like Joan of Arc so well, and Kathy Fiscus, and why the snowplow goes by. And I mean, it's just amazing. I saw a little girl about a year and a half ago that was in a little wheelchair while I was up writing my books. I write the books out at the mall because Kathy died, and so I have my insurance stuff and business in the morning, have lunch, go out to the mall and write. And a lot of the stories occur in the mall, murders in the mall, and so forth. And I was up there writing, and I looked over, and there was a father and a mother and a little girl sitting there, and the little girl had a mask on. And I looked over there, and I said, well, that's a cute little girl, and so forth. And then she took the mask off, and she started eating. But I was far enough away, I couldn't tell for sure. And finally, when they were all through, I kept glancing over there because she touched my heart. And I kind of glanced over there, and then they were through. She put the mask back on, and then they backed her out of her chair, and she was in a little tiny girl's wheelchair. Well, that just broke. I just started crying. I couldn't cry out loud because of that, but I just had these tears coming down my face because I was so touched by that poor little girl. So I've just always had this compassion, for all these people. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. And we had a question come in from Mike. He said, Mr. Fisher, what's the book? What was the name of the book that your grandpa wrote? And also your free online book again, too. So let me mention the online book. The link is in the description. It's a guide to understanding the transgender mystery. But what was your grandfather's book?
It was called The Gun and the Gospel. And his name was Hugh Dunn Fisher. It's an old book. It's a collector's. I actually have the original copy of his book. Got it kind of in a roundabout way. But he was in Quantrill's raid, and he was sick. And so he was a Methodist minister. He started the Methodist Church in Kansas. And he was a Methodist minister, but he was sick. And Quantrill wanted to come and get him. And he wanted to get also one other guy, General somebody, I can't remember what it was, but he was who Quantrill was after. And so my great-great-grandfather, he tells about it in his book and so forth, but when they heard, they were always worried that Quantrill was going to come in the raid. And the story goes on that she says, all of a sudden, she turns to her husband, she says, it's here, it's happening, it's Quantrill's raid is started. And he couldn't leave, his kids all left. And went up in the hills by the University of Kansas and so forth and hid kind of out in the country. But his wife took him down in the basement and hid him down in the basement because they were after him. Well, Quantrill's raiders come up and they bang on the door and so forth. And they know that's his house. And they say they want to say, bring him out right now. And she said, he's not here. She said, we know he's here. Bring him out. And she said, he is not here. So finally they came in and they talked to her. And one of the Quantrill's raiders saw her little boy. And thought, he said, I think it was John, and thought, oh, he's a cute little guy and so forth. And they kind of did that. And she said, no, he's not there. And they said, well, we're going to check the house. So they checked the house and they went down in the basement, and the basement was all dirt. And my great-great-grandfather was in the basement, and it was kind of a crawl space kind of basement. There was just areas that you could stand up in. And he hid, and he said he had to lay his head on its side because otherwise his head would have popped up over the top of the dirt mound. So he couldn't even just lay it straight down. It had to be on his side as small as he could make it. And he said they were right there. He could hear him talking. He could hear him breathing, but they didn't catch it. So they went upstairs and they said, well, we couldn't find him, but we know he's here. So they burned his house down. Well, she said, well, can I take out some of my things? And they said, you can do whatever you want to, but your house is gone. And so they burned it down and they left. Well, but they stayed out watching it burn down. Well, she got one of her neighbors, and they went down in the basement, rolled my great-great-grandfather up in a carpet and carried him out. And he laid behind a tree, rolled up in the carpet, as I understand, rolled up in the carpet while his house burned down. And then then they left, and that's when he came back. Later, they wanted to make him a not state representative, but a member of the House of Representatives. And he said, no, he said, God's work is here for me. I'm not going to do that. So he didn't do it. Now, another couple of interesting things. He released the first slaves in Kansas, and he drove to Missouri, got them and brought them back. And that, as the story goes in his book, that is, he brings them across the border into Kansas. Everybody stands up and he raises his hands in the air and turns around on his saddle and he says, "You're free." And everybody just started crying. So he was a very interesting person. I also have which is just a little side note real quick, I have an uncle that was the head of the mechanical engineering department at the University of Kansas that invented the first carburetor for Briggs and Stratton that allowed us to all have lawnmowers. He invented the variable pitch airplane propeller, and he invented the delivery system on the two delivery systems that dropped the two bombs in Japan. He was later on Operation Blue Book, and they sent him down to Roswell, New Mexico to find out about that. But he would never tell anybody whether they were really UFOs. He'd always say, "Oh, there are." These little green men would fly in this little green spaceship, land in the backyard, and climb up and have dinner with Ruth and I. He would never tell. But yeah, so I've had some interesting relatives.
Wow, you have a lot of creativity in your family.
Yeah, a lot of them. Well, that's kind of what led to developing the pocket computer system. And just a lot. I've always tried, and there's a lot of creativity in Who Killed Who, a love story. I can't say what the genre is, but it's a very interesting book that probably everybody would be interested in.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, I'll have to look into that.
Yeah.
Well, do you want to tell your thing about creativity, about what keeps you inspired?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I've always liked Walt Disney. And in fact, when we went to Walt Disney or Disneyland on our honeymoon. Kathy and I did. But anyway, I've always liked his creativity. And one of the things that I did when I was my daughter, when she graduated from the University of Kansas, she and a friend actually went to Walt Disney World because they knew I loved Disney, though I never said anything. And she actually turned around and worked in a little place. It was in Tomorrowland, and that's where she met her husband. But anyway, we would go down. I go there every year, and it's free. So that I go in and spend a week for around Christmas time, and then we go in. We spend almost every day at Walt Disney World, and it's free. Parking's free, and I have a free place to stay. And we go through all the rides. One of my favorite rides is the Peter Pan ride, because my mom used to read that to us, and you fly out the window in Neverland, and then you go over London and so forth, and I can just visualize how this all fits together. So we were going through one ride called the Journey Through Imagination. And it's a wonderful journey. And when you get through, what you do then at that particular point is you have to walk out through a little kind of a store, and they have things for sale that remind you of the ride. And I had a little money left over from the gift card my daughter and granddaughter and granddaughters gave me. And so I saw this little thing of Figment, which is the character that you see popping up all the time as you're going through the various things of using your imagination. And so I saw that and I thought, I'll just buy that, because that will just spur me on to constantly keep using my imagination. So now I have right in the middle of my bed, I make my bed every night or every morning, and right in the middle of the bed is Figment. And it always reminds me, every time that I see that, I just think, Dave, use your imagination. And this little fleur-de-lis that I have, I came up with this idea because it kind of pops out of your shirts. The fleur-de-lis reminds me of Joan of Arc. I have one that is my college. It's Mr. Ichabod, which is the college. I have one of the high school that I go to. I've got several, but my favorite one is really the butterfly. And I wear the butterfly, and I've got several different little sizes and so forth. I wear that because it always reminds me to use my imagination, use your creativity, because like a caterpillar, you never know when something might burst open and a beautiful butterfly will come out. So I've always used that as kind of a little thing. So every time, almost every T-shirt that I have, I will have one of many T-shirts that have a different emblem. And I thought I'd use the fleur-de-lis because of Joan of Arc on this one.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, it's been so wonderful to hear your story of faith and then your journey with understanding transgender people. And, I did have one question about, a lot of people are going to be curious, when you said you brought the razor up to your face and it was just revealed to you that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Can you describe it? Was it an audible voice you heard? Was it a feeling? Was it an impression? What did you experience there?
It wasn't an audible thing. It wasn't a voice, but what it was a just unbelievable knowledge. In other words, all of a sudden, Jesus is the Son of God. I mean, and I just, wow, I just could not believe. I could not believe it. That's a poor way of saying it. All of a sudden, I did totally know that Jesus is the Son of God. I don't know how to describe that, because it's not a revolution. It's something that all of a sudden you just know, and there's no question about it. Would I ever jump off of a cliff if that wasn't true or not? No, because the Bible tells us you should never tempt the Lord your God. I would never do that, but I know that Jesus is the Son of God. I don't have any question about it. Now, that was a long time ago. That was June 3rd, 1969, but that date has always stayed with me. And I've never forgotten that. Just like so many things that happened with Joan of Arc and Kathy Fiscus, they become a part of you. And there's an old saying that I've always used too, and that is, what you do today will determine your character tomorrow. And that's true. If you put something off today, tomorrow you're put off. And I traveled around the country putting on weight management seminars for the military and police and fire departments and hospitals and schools and colleges and so forth, just as a sidelight, because I developed that program using the pocket computer systems and so forth. And I always tell people, if you want to lose weight, remember, what you do today will determine your weight tomorrow. And it really kind of picks it up. And I would teach everybody I've never had a weight management problem since I started the idea. I did for a little period. I was probably 30 pounds heavier, and then I got down to my ideal weight. I weigh myself every morning, and I weigh myself every night just before I go to bed. But I asked myself before I get on the scale, so I don't really do that much anymore, because I know what I've been doing and what to expect. But I asked myself, what went on in your life since you last weighed that would affect your weight? Based on that, how much do you think you weigh? Then you get on the scales and check. If you're right, congratulate yourself. If you're wrong, you ask yourself, why? Did I ask something with a little extra salt? Did I skip a meal? Did I not eat as much normal? And pretty soon you learn how your body works. But still, to control your weight, you have to do that, so that because if you go on a vacation or something like that, I go on a vacation, I lose or gain usually about 5 pounds on a vacation, something like that. But when I get back, it takes me just about a week to get all the way back off again, because there's no way I'm going to keep that. I've just always been, as a phys ed major, always liked, proper weight and proper exercise.
Well, wow, that's wonderful. And the audience has really appreciated what you've said tonight. So thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure getting to know you. Thank you. And for those who are watching, please do check out Dave's book if you have questions about the mystery of being transgender. It's something Dave has looked into, and it's already helped one person on my channel. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Good. It's funny, the story about when I was revealed to me, that started out one thing, and now it's kind of almost in a way all over the world. So you never know when God will touch something, and you tell people about it, and who knows what will happen. So it's been a real honor to be with you. I just love your show, and I'll look forward to watching future episodes.
Thank you so much. God bless you.
God bless you too.